Today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim Kuf Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Joanna Ram in appreciation of Dai Gittel for her leadership and creativity in putting together a wonderful Pesach cookbook, contributions from Daf Yomi students around the world. Anyone who's interested, you can contact us. We'll send you a copy of it. And yeah, Dai, thank you for all your hard work. Okay, I want to just remind everyone we're getting close to the Siyum. Details will be sent out soon. The Siyum will be on the Siyum will be on March 22nd. And what else? I wanted to say that if anybody wants to consider sponsoring Masechet Shkalim, our next Masechet is coming up. It's always a nice opportunity for a sponsorship. So it's a short Masechet. I think it's 22 dapim. So we'll be done with it soon after. Oh, sorry, correction. I knew I wasn't saying the right thing. The Siyum is March 21st. My mistake. The Siyum is the English Siyum is March 21st. The Hebrew Siyum is March 22nd. So we're going to have back to back, right? Sunday will be the English Siyum and Monday, the 22nd, will be the Hebrew Siyum. So sorry for the confusion. Okay. We're going to start now from on our daf. Our daf is Kuf Aleph. We're starting from the bottom of Kuf Amud Bet. Otam b'nei adam shekitshu b'beit hakneset. So the people who made Kiddush in the shul, we started with this yesterday, and we're learning that there was a custom to do Kiddush in the shul at night. Okay, we're talking about only at night, not like we do Kiddushes in shul during the morning. We're talking about at night. We'll talk about why it's clear. We'll see this later. Right? Kiddush at night is much more important than Kiddush during the day. We'll get to that another time. According to Rav, they fulfill their obligation of wine. Now, what does that mean? But not Kiddush. So what this means is not maybe what you think it means, that there's two aspects of Kiddush. One is wine, one is Kiddush. No, that's not what we're talking about. What we mean is, Yidei Yayin Lo Yatzu, that means if I make Kiddush in shul, and then I go home and I want to have wine during my meal, forget Kiddush. This is like a brachot related issue, something you would find in Masechet Brachot. In fact, they do talk about it in Masechet Brachot, which is, did the bracha that I made in shul, does it cover me for what I'm going to say at home, for what I'm going to drink? So according to Rav, no, it doesn't cover your wine at home. You're in two different places. That doesn't work. But yidei kiddush yatzu, but you are yotze kiddush. Okay, that covers you for your kiddush, even though what? Even though you didn't eat there, all you did was make kiddush. Ushmuel amar af yidei kiddush lo yatzu. Now there are actually going to be three opinions, and if you have the sheet from today, you'll see the sheet I put together. There's three opinions on the chart, but the third opinion, which is Rabbi Yochanan, we're only going to get to at the bottom of Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph. Okay, why is that? It's possible Rav and Shmuel were Babylonian, and Rabbi Yochanan was living in Israel, and it could be that the sugya was a Bavli sugya, and then they found out Rabbi Yochanan said something else, and they added at the end. It's possible. Otherwise, I'm not really sure why, but that seems to me like a possibility. So in any case, right now we have two opinions. Rav says this covers you for your Kiddush, but it doesn't help you if you want to drink wine at home. You have to make a new borei preagafen, right? You don't make Kiddush again, but you make a new borei preagafen. According to Shmuel, well, we'll see, you do make Kiddush, but that's for a different reason. But you don't theoretically need to make Kiddush. Shmuel says, not wine and not Kiddush. You're not yotze anything. You have to start from the beginning, as if, right, this doesn't cover you for anything. So now we're going to have a question on each approach. So according to Rav, what's the point of Kiddush in your house if that's the case? So, right, why would you make Kiddush in your house if you already fulfilled your obligation in shul? So he says, and this is classic, well, there's people in your house who haven't fulfilled their obligation of Kiddush because they didn't go to shul and they didn't hear Kiddush there. So for those people, you have to take care of them, right? You have to do it in the house for them. Okay, and the assumption is, right, the kids and the wives probably didn't go to shul, right? And even if they did, so, we're talking about the general, that not everybody ends up in shul, and therefore you have to do it again. Ushmuel, and obviously according to Shmuel, we're going to have a bigger question, which is, why did they make Kiddush in shul? If it doesn't help you, then what's the point, right? Almost you could say, not only what's the point, but it's what we call a bracha levatala. You're saying something that is just wasted because you're not fulfilling your obligation anyway. So he says, for a different reason. There's guests that show up in shul, and those guests need Kiddush said for them, and they eat in the shul. Now, this is why it's interesting that this custom seemed to have developed outside of Israel. In Israel, right, and it's very interesting because today it's also the case. In Israel, generally, you don't have people living in the shuls, right, and eating in the shul. But outside of Israel, right, it's very common. You go somewhere for Shabbat and you show up in shul and there's a whole meal out there because they assume that there's going to be people walking in. And, maybe in Israel it happens too, but nobody really, they just don't do it. It's just not done. So because of this, they make Kiddush in shul. And in fact, I remember growing up in America, and they used to make Kiddush every Friday night in shul, right? The shamash would get up, he would make Kiddush, and all the kids would line up, and the kids would, get grape juice. It was a big fun thing. So now we're going to learn why the kids had grape juice, because if, according to Shmuel, you don't fulfill your obligation because you're not eating a meal there, then theoretically there's this other issue, which you're not supposed to eat before you make Kiddush. So you actually can't drink the wine. So they specifically give it to children to drink. Right? They make the blessing and then children drink the wine, specifically them, not the person who makes Kiddush, which becomes an interesting thing, right? Because you think, what do you mean? You just made a blessing. How do you not drink? And when else does this come up that we give to children? On the 9 days. You're not supposed to have wine, right? On the other hand, you're supposed to make Havdalah on wine, right? So what do you, right? On Shabbat, you can because you're allowed on Shabbat, but during the 9 days, when the 9 days are over, Motzei Shabbat, you're not allowed to. So often we give it, if you have a child there, you give the child to drink the wine or even the grape juice you shouldn't be drinking. So obviously, what do you do if you don't have children, right? It's a separate problem, then you drink it. But if there are, you give it to someone else to drink. It doesn't say this in the Gemara, but the Rishonim comment on this issue. So now, and then he says, these orchim, how are they able to fulfill their obligation? Because these people eat and drink and sleep in the Beit Knesset. It also raises an issue. Well, how do people sleep in the Beit Knesset? There's halachic issues, can't sleep in the Beit Knesset. He claims, well, they were sleeping right next, in a place adjacent to the Beit Knesset. They weren't actually sleeping in the shul. That's one thing. Another question that comes up is, well, if we don't have guests anymore in shul, then why do we still do this custom? And then they discuss that this is a custom that, and I see you're asking exactly that. If there's no guests, do you not make Kiddush? No, because it's a custom that this happens very often where a custom develops for a particular reason. Even when the reason is no longer there, we still keep up the custom. And that's why it's very customary in shuls and abroad to, yes, make Kiddush, even if there aren't necessarily guests there. And even if it's a shul where there's never, ever guests who show up, they continue the custom. I'll give you another example. And it's interesting because it's specifically Friday night. And also I see what you're saying, Gita, this extra brachot in Mariv in outside of America, which also I was going to point out the other thing in Friday night davening, which is Magen Avot. Magen Avot is this very shortened version of almost like a Chazarat Hashatz, like a repetition of Shemon Esrei, very short in Mariv on Friday night. You never have a repetition of Shemon Esrei. Why do we do this? It's because people would come late to shul on Friday, and then they would leave later than everyone else, and it would be dangerous for them to walk out. Now, even once it was no longer dangerous, and they weren't living in communities where there was any danger to walk around at night alone, they still kept up the custom. And that's the whole idea is we add an extra prayer so that the people can catch up and they won't have to leave, that they'll all leave at the same time. So that's a custom that we've continued in all shuls, even though that's not necessarily needed anymore. Okay, so there you have two examples in Friday night davening where those stayed. Okay, so let's keep on with Shmuel now. As to Shmuel l'ta'ameh, and Shmuel is actually consistent within his approach. Ta'amar Shmuel ein kiddush ela b'mkom seudan. This is very famous. And why is it so famous? Because we hold this way, that you can only make, now what's interesting about it is Rav doesn't hold this way. Shmuel says you can only make Kiddush if you're actually having a meal. You have to have Kiddush with the meal. Why is that? It seems to be connected to Oneg Shabbat, right? As part of Oneg Shabbat, if you drink Kiddush and you don't actually eat a meal, so you're not really enjoying, because the whole idea is to eat food and you're not having your food with it. Okay, now there's a few questions. What is makom and what is seudah? Okay, so what does it mean in the place that you're eating? How much of the place does it need to be? Like often on Shabbat morning, I'll make Kiddush in the kitchen because I'm kind of there, and then I'll eat in the other room, right, at the table, which, right, my kitchen table is a little far from the kitchen counter, or well, let's say I go to eat in the dining room, right? Can you make Kiddush in the kitchen and then go eat in your dining room? Does that count as makom suda, right? When you're eating a formal meal, not as much so, but when I make Kiddush in the morning on Shabbat, I'm not eating a whole meal. So it's more likely that I'll kind of do Kiddush in the kitchen and then I'll move and eat somewhere else. Is that okay or not? Number two, what does it mean, a meal? And this is always classic, particularly, right? Normally, Friday night, this isn't an issue because you always make Kiddush and then you eat your meal. It's very rare that you would make Kiddush and not eat a meal after. But if, and this was the whole thing with Pores Mapo Makadesh, there it's interesting because it went with your meal that was before, right? You make Kiddush at the end of the meal, according to not Pores Mapo Makadesh, but the other opinion that we saw where Em Mafsikin, if you remember, the whole idea was you make Kiddush at the end of the meal, but at least it was still connected to a meal. Okay, even though you weren't actually eating, but you were still in the place where you had eaten your meal. So now Shmuel says you need Kiddush b'makom suda. So Savar Mine, when they heard him say this, they assumed, okay, who's this? Whenever you hear a Savar Mine, it usually means the students, people who heard him, thought. Now, thought usually in the Gemara means, well, they thought something, but they were wrong. What did they think? They thought that Hanemile mi bayit lebayit, that when he meant Ein Kiddush el makom suda, it meant you can't make Kiddush in your neighbor's house and then go eat in your house without eating anything in your neighbor's house, or in shul and then come home, right? Classic Shabbat in the morning, you hear Kiddush in shul, but you don't eat any food. Is that okay? Were you Yotze Kiddush? Did you fulfill your obligation? So no, not according to Shmuel, because you didn't do it b'makom suda. We're going to see later that even though somebody ate there, and theoretically often we say someone can, do it for you, right? Someone can make Kiddush, you can listen and be what we call Yotze, right? You fulfilled your obligation through listening to them. So let's say they ate, but you didn't. Does that work for you? So we're going to see, no, that doesn't work. You yourself have to personally eat where you make Kiddush. So they thought he meant not from house to house. But they thought that what he meant was, if you're in the same house and you go from one area of your house to another, it's fine. Okay, now there's a difference of girsa here between different people, different versions of the text. Some people have it like we do. Other people have aval mipina lepina becha beitalo, even from corner to corner in one house, which would basically preclude what I said about making Kiddush in the kitchen and eating, let's say, in the dining room. Okay, maybe kitchen to kitchen table, maybe it's still considered the same room, but kitchen to dining room would already be a different area. Okay, and that's the big, what we call nafkamina, halachic difference between the two different versions. According to this version, we're going to see mimakom lamakom becha beita is going to mean two different floors, let's say. Okay, and how do we know this? Because look at the continuation. So they thought that it's okay if you, let's assume right now, makom lamakom is two different floors in the house. So now, Amar lehu Rav Ana bar Tachlifa, zimnin sagi and hava ka'imna kamei de Shmuel. There were lots of times where I was in front of Shmuel. Now, the best way, okay, one of the things about this parak that's nice is that it's incredibly practical, and we have all sorts of practical examples and practical halachic relevancies from what we're learning. But what's even more nice about it is that we're going to have, and particularly in today's stuff, we're going to see we're going to learn from rabbis by what they did and not necessarily by only what they said, but we have lots of cases of things that happen because this comes up all the time. So Amar Rav Ana bar Tachlifa, he said to them, but that's not true what you said, because there were many times when I was in front of Shmuel, or maybe it happened, once or twice, and he went from the attic to the main floor, V'hadar Makadesh, and he made Kiddush again. Okay, so now we're going to see that he was on a different floor, and he obviously didn't eat upstairs, and therefore when he went downstairs, he made Kiddush again. Okay, so here you see that Shmuel himself made sure that within the house, now this is why it's depending on your girsa, this seems to imply two different levels, whereas maybe mipina lepina is okay. But if your version is that they thought he meant mipina lepina is okay, and then the story comes to tell you no, even though the details of the story don't really match that, but the assumption is, does it matter attic to lower floor or corner to corner? That's all considered different space, and therefore you have to actually be in the space where you're planning to eat. And then that would say, take your, don't be lazy, don't make your Kiddush in the kitchen, go over to the table where you're going to actually eat and make your Kiddush there. So it depends what your girsa is, how you would, whether it's just two different floors is a problem, but on one floor it's the same. By the way, this issue, when I see someone asked it, it also affects sukkah, right? The famous minhag of Shmini Atzeret, where people make Kiddush in the sukkah and then come eat in the house, is a good question. How do you do this? So some people explain that it also depends on what your intent is. If you intended, so there for sure, when you make Kiddush, you intend that you're going to eat inside. So then maybe it's okay because you already know in the beginning and you have that in mind, and maybe having in mind helps. Also most people also make hamotzi in the sukkah and then go inside to continue eating their meal, so they at least have Kiddush b'makom suda. Okay, so there's a debate about that also. Okay, that issue comes up. So now, Af Rav Huna Saval, Ein Kiddush Ela B'Mkom Suda. Now we're going to see that not only did Shmuel think this. Now again, what I want to point out in this sugya that's very interesting is Rav didn't hold by this Kiddush B'Makom Suda, right? We take this as a given. Kiddush B'Makom Suda, you have to have Kiddush in the Makom Suda, right? So if you're at a Kiddush in the morning and they make Kiddush, you have to eat. Now, I didn't discuss, the Gemara doesn't discuss what is a Seudah, okay? And in 1 minute, I'll get off on exactly what counts as a Seudah. But whatever is going to count as a Seudah, if you go to a Kiddush in the morning, now again, you can't eat until you make Kiddush, because that's one of these issues of we don't want you to eat until you make Kiddush, so that we ensure that you take care of the mitzvah and you don't forget about it. So that you make sure to take care of Kiddush. So therefore, in the morning, if you're in shul and they make Kiddush and you don't eat anything, so you have to make Kiddush again when you get home. You can't eat. You can't taste a little bit of food if you're not going to actually eat what we call whatever constitutes a seudah. And that's because you need Kiddush b'makom suda in order to fulfill your obligation. So now, Af Rav Huna Saval. So now we're going to see how we know, okay, this is going to be why in the end we all paskin like Shmuel, because normally, actually, in issues like this, there's a general rule when Rav and Shmuel disagree. We paskin like Rav when it comes to Isur v'Heter, like things of the, you call it like a halachic realm, rather than Dine Mamono. Generally, Shmuel, we paskin for Dine Mamono, like laws and issues between people and legal issues. But when it comes to halachic issues, it's more Rav. So this would fall into the category of Rav, but we're going to see that we don't paskin like Rav here, and we're going to see why, because we're going to see a list of people who all held like Shmuel. Af Rav Huna Savar Ein Kiddush Ela B'Mkom Suda. How do we know? Rav Huna also held this way. Why? How do we know? Because again, a story. De Rav Huna Kaddish V'it Akra Le'Shraga. He made Kiddush, and then his candle blew out. Now, there's a debate here, again, about how to understand this. His candle blew out, so he said, I can't eat here. Now, why can't you eat here? Is it a halachic thing? Are you not allowed to eat your meal, your Shabbos meal in the dark? And maybe, again, it's part of Oneg Shabbat. It's only enjoyable if you can see your food, and it's not enjoyable to eat in the pitch black. It happened to me once Friday night. I had my brother's family over, and we had a power failure, and then we sat there eating in the dark. I mean, luckily the candles were still going and we had some light, but it was exactly this, it wasn't so pleasant. We did have candlelight, but it wasn't, we moved near where the candles were and we ate there, and it wasn't exactly the best, the best Shabbos meal. I mean, we made of it, it was fine, but you could see why people would say it's not exactly so enjoyable to eat in the dark. Now, so his candle went out, and he didn't have, his candle went out, so he didn't have any light. Forget about his electricity blew, right? He didn't even have his candles. That's really dark. Some people say it's a halachic issue. So is it a halachic issue, or is it just it was not pleasant and he just didn't want to eat there, so he moved somewhere else? He went into the Chatan's house. His son, I guess, must have gotten married, and they were having meals there. I don't know why he wasn't there. Okay, but he went there, and there was a candle. V'kadish v'tayim midian. Even though he made Kiddush in the first place, he made Kiddush again and ate something. Now, what does it mean now? Here we get to, so first of all, you see he needed Kiddush b'makom suda because his first one didn't count. Second of all, it says here, tayim midi. He ate something. Now that seems to indicate he didn't necessarily eat a full meal. Okay, maybe there wasn't enough food, and he kind of, popped into the party and there wasn't enough food to go around. Maybe that's why he only ate a little bit. It's not so clear. But tayim midi generally means you didn't eat very much. So then the question becomes, what is Suda? And for this, there's a whole discussion among the commentaries, what constitutes Suda? And this is a general question when we talk about meals. What's considered a meal? Right? Generally, we say it's bread. However, it could be also mizonot, or anything that you make, what we call bracha chamein shalosh, which is alamichya, or the fruits that Israel is known for, the shivat haminim. So any of those things, according to most opinions, would constitute a seudah. And if it's not that, more like shahakol things that you just make a shahakol on, that wouldn't count for your seudah. So it shows here that it doesn't have to be bread necessarily, and certainly not lechem mishnah. Alma kasavar ein kiddush ela b'makom suda. So you can infer from the story that he thought that you need kiddush b'makom suda. Va'af Rabba savar ein kiddush ela b'makom suda. Rabba also held this way. How do we know? Dama Abaye. Okay, we always hear about Rabba from Abaye, because remember he was adopted by Rabba. So Abaye told us, Ki avina be Mar. Again, we get a story. When I was in Mar's house, Mar is the way he refers to Rabba. Ki ava mekadesh, when he would make kiddush, and we were standing around, and we were about to go home. but we'd be standing around for Kiddush with him. So he would make Kiddush. Amar lan, he would say to us, Ti'imu midi, eat something now. Dilma adazalitu liushpiza mitakra l'chushraga. Because it could be that by the time you get back to the place where you're staying, it could be your candle will blow out. And then you're not going to end up making Kiddush in a place where you eat. Because again, it's this issue. The candle will be out. You won't end up eating. And you're not going to be able to fulfill your obligation through my Kiddush because you haven't eaten anything. So therefore, eat now so that this will cover you just in case something happens when you get home and the candle's out. This is, the pessimist, like who knows what might be, or the worrier. So make sure to eat now, he says to them. So now the Gemara says, Ini, is it really true that Rabbah holds that you need Kiddush Makom Suda? Now the real issue is going to be not necessarily he says something about Kiddush Makom Suda, but it's going to be that he paskins like Shmuel against Rav. Okay, that's the issue. So now, why is this a problem? Vahamar Abaye himself said about Rabbah again, Kol mile demal, in all issues, Mar, which is again Rabbah, Hava Avid Kirav, he always held like Rav against Shmuel. Levar mehane tzlata avi kishmuel, other than in 3 places that he held like Shmuel. So now, if you take this statement, before we continue, what are you expecting to see? Well, it's a question. But if it weren't a question, you would expect to see that he held like Rav in all cases except for 3. And one of those 3 should be Kiddush b'makam suda, because otherwise, right, it doesn't make any sense here. So right, he holds like Shmuel and not Rav. So this should be one of the 3 exceptions. But lo and behold, it's not one of the 3 exceptions. And that's why this is brought as a contradiction. So which of the 3 did he hold like Shmuel? We've seen this before. Mitirin mi beged lebeged, umadlikim miner lener, v'halacha keRabbi Shimon b'Grera, detanya Rabbi Shimon omer, gorer adam mita kiseh v'safsal b'Shabbat, u'vad shelo yitkaven lasot charitz. Okay, these are the 3 places where he holds like Shmuel. And Shmuel is lenient in these 3 cases we're going to see. First is mitirimi beged lebeged. If you have tzitzit, the strings on your 4-corner garment, and you want to take them off and move them to a different pair of tzitzit, right? Let's say the shirt is all ruined, and you want to just take the strings and move them over. You're allowed to do it according to Shmuel. According to Rav, this is bizoi mitzvah. It's a desecration for a mitzvah. It's on a pair of tzitzit. You can't just take them off and reuse them, even if you're reusing them for a mitzvah. Shmuel will say you can't take them off if you want to kind of hang something on a string and use it for some other purpose. But if you're using it for another mitzvah, it's fine. Likewise, madlikimi ner lener. It's a big debate about what exactly this is referring to. Is it Hanukkah candles? Is it Hanukkah candles from one candle to the other? Is it even if you use an interim candle to light from one to a candle and then from there to another candle? What's the issue here? The issue is, again, that if you light from candle to candle, we always say what's unique about a candle, you don't actually take away at all, right? So Shmuel says you're not really taking away from the first candle, and therefore it's not a bizui mitzvah. Rav will say, what do you mean? You're using some of the oil to light it, and it is taking away from the mitzvah, and you're not allowed to do it because, again, it's disgracing a mitzvah. Now, forget about the fact that you can't use Hanukkah candles. That's all a separate question. But right now, they're talking about from this aspect of it. And again, like I said, there's different interpretations. We'll leave it aside right now. And halakha Rabbi Shimon b'Grera. This is famous. We've seen this all throughout Masechet Shabbat about what we call davar she'eino mitkaven. Rabbi Shimon says that if you're dragging a chair or a bed or a bench across the floor, you can do it even if it's ground in dirt, even if it's going to make a hole. As long as you're not trying to dig a hole. Digging a hole is a malacha. So if you're not trying to do the malacha, but you're trying to do some other action, that's what we call davar she'eino mitkaven. You're not intending, and therefore that's fine according to Rabbi Shimon. What does this have to do with passing like Shmuel? Because Shmuel obviously held like Rabbi Shimon, and Rav held like Rabbi Yehuda, who said davar she'eino mitkaven is a problem. Okay, you can't do it, right? Even if you're not intending to do the malacha, the fact that you're doing a malacha is a problem. So now back to our question: If Rabbah held like Shmuel, this should have been one of the 3 exceptions to the rule, where in general Rabbah held like Rav, but except for these 3. So how could it be that Rabbah held like Shmuel in Kiddush b'Makom Suda? So what do they answer? He only held like Rav when it said he held like Rav in all things except for these 3. What it meant is every time that Rav was more stringent than Shmuel, he held like Rav, except for 3 cases where he held the lenient opinion like Shmuel. But in our case, Shmuel is the more stringent opinion. So that just wasn't included in this list. That list was all, he was careful to be as stringent as he could be and held like Rav in all these cases, other than 3 cases where he didn't see a reason for the stringency. However, in Kiddush Makam Sudi, he's holding like Shmuel because it's a stringency. That wasn't what he was referring to in that statement. So therefore, that doesn't contradict at all. That's the end of Rav and Shmuel for now, and we're going to move on to Rabbi Yochanan. As I told you in the beginning, there's 3 opinions. So let's go back for a minute. We have people who make Kiddush in the shul. Rav said, you have to make a new bracha when you get to your house if you want to drink wine during your meal, but you don't have to make Kiddush again. So all you would do is Borei Peri Agafen. You don't have to say the whole text of Kiddush and not the bracha Mekadesh HaShabbat. Remember, Kiddush has 2 blessings. We'll get to those soon in the upcoming Mishnah, which is, right, there's Mekadesh HaShabbat and there's Borei Peri Agafen. So if you want to drink other wine during the meal, you don't have to make a new you'd have to make a new blessing, but you don't have to make Kiddush. Shmuel says, you're not, nothing, not wine, not Kiddush, right? New blessing at home, both on the wine and on Kiddush. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Af Yidei Yayin Nami Yatsu. He says, not only Kiddush, is it okay? Also wine, meaning if you make Kiddush in shul, you don't have to make a blessing on the wine when you get back home. If you want to drink wine during your meal, you covered yourself in shul. Va'az de Rabbi Yochanan the Tamein, he's consistent within his approach. To Amar Rab Chanim Bar Abaye, Amar Rabbi Pedat, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. It was passed down 2 generations in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Echad shinui yayin, ve'echad shinui makom, ein tzarich levarech. What does he say? Whether you add new wine to the table, okay, your first Borei Peri Agafen covers any wine you're going to bring to the table. Now you might say this sounds a little strange. I mean, anytime if I eat fruits, I eat apples, and then we bring oranges to the table. I don't have to make a new blessing on them. So why would we even think that with wine you would have to? So either he's just telling us that simple halacha, and this is obviously applicable for everything else, or maybe he's telling us you might have thought that with wine, because wine has significance, maybe each new bottle of wine you bring is going to require its own Borei Peri Agafen, and he's coming to teach you it's not the case. Okay. Now, the commentaries comment that, by the way, of course you have to. I think it's in the Rashbam here. Yeah. If you look at the Rashbam, Echad Shinui Yayin, it's about 8 lines from the bottom of the Rashbam on the Amud Aleph. Okay, he says, Sheviu lo yayin michavit acheret, v'yesh lo tam mishuneh. If it has a different taste, that's what he's trying to say. Even though it tastes different, you don't have to make its own blessing on it. O garua o meshubach, it doesn't matter if it's better or worse. Ein tzarich levarech shenit al yayin, aval. But he says, however, you don't need to make a Borei Peri Agafen, but you do need to make a different bracha, and that he's not relating to. Hatova hamitiv miyat mevarech meshubach min harishon, as it says in the Gemara Brachot, that if you bring a better wine to the table, then you actually have to make a blessing of Hatova hamitiv. That's something different. This is very relevant when you're making Kiddush on Friday night or on Shabbos morning. If you make on grape juice or you make on that sweet red wine, which is not kind of a fancy wine, and then you want to drink nicer wine during the meal, you have to make a bracha Hatova hamitiv unless it was on the table already. If it was on the table, then you don't have to. But otherwise, you have to make a blessing, Hatova hamitiv. If it wasn't on the table when you make Kiddush and it wasn't in mind, right? The idea is if it's on the table, then it means you had it in mind. So if it wasn't on the table, you have to make a Hatova hamitiv, but that's not what he's referring to. He's referring to if you add wine, you don't have to make a Borei Peri Agafen. Ve'echad shinoi makom. Here's the big line that he says, which we're going to have some issues with. If you change places, and this is based on what we saw Rabbi Yochanan said, it doesn't matter if you were in the shul and now you come to your house, it's just continuing basically. Then you don't need to make a bracha. Obviously, the question is how far do we go, right? In other words, sounds like then maybe you don't need to do brachot all day. You make one bracha in the morning and that covers you for the entire day, right? Wherever you go, wherever you are. Obviously, there's a cutoff point, right? It's not forever. Meitive. So now they bring a question from a Braita on what Rabbi Yochanan says, and we're actually going to end with Tiyufta to Rabbi Yochanan Tiyufta. This really seems to knock out his approach based on this Braita, because again, Amoraim can't go against explicit Braita. So it says in the Braita, Shinoi makom tzarich levarech. If you change places, it says you do need to make a new blessing. So Rabbi Yochanan's going against an explicit Braita. Shinoi yayin ein tzarich levarech. But if you change wines in your meal, then you don't have to make another Borei Peri Agafen. And therefore, they conclude Tiyufta to Rabbi Yochanan Tiyufta. This really does seem like a big question on what he says, that your Borei Peri Agafen in shul can cover you when you get home. And likewise, it sounds like if you're anywhere and you make a Borei Peri Agafen and then you come to your house, you don't have to make a new blessing. Yativ Rav Idi bar Abin kamei to Rav Chisda. V'yativ Rav Chisda v'kamar mishmei to Rav Huna. Now we're going to deal with this Braita. This Braita said, Shinoi makom tzarich levarech. You have to make a new bracha. So now they're going to limit this. They're going to say it's not exactly true across the board. So what happened here? Rav Idi bar Avin was sitting in front of Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda says in the name of Rav Huna. Okay, he was sitting with him, and he passes down the name of Rav Huna. Remember this because next thing is Rav Chisda is going to say in his own name. When the Braita said that you have to, if you change locations, you have to make a blessing. That's only, again, this goes back to what we saw in the beginning of the page, which is that's if you're talking about from house to house, but one place to another within the house, you don't have to. Now, just like before, there were different versions. Also here, there's different versions. Is this makom lemakom, meaning from the house to the attic? Maybe you don't need to make a new blessing, Borei Pragafen. Whereas Su'uda didn't work that way, but making another Borei Pragafen would work. Or is it mipina lepina, which would mean, right, from corner to corner, like my kitchen to my dining room, I don't have to make a new blessing on wine. But maybe if I go upstairs to eat rather than downstairs, right, I was eating downstairs and then I went upstairs, maybe then you would need to make a separate blessing. So it all depends on what version you have in the text, and that makes a big difference, halacha l'maaseh, what you're going to do. Amalei Rav Idi bar Avin. So Rav Idi bar Avin now questions this statement of Rav Chisda that he says in the name of Rav Huna. And he says, Hachi tanina le b'manita debei Rav Hanek. What he said is actually found in a Braita from the house of Rav Hanek. And some people say b'manita debei Hanek kavatech, which is really the same thing, which is in the Braita from the house of Rav Hanek, they say just like you. Now, why is that a question? But Ella Rav Huna manitin kamashmalan. Rav Huna is coming to tell us a new halacha as if it's a new halacha, but it said it in a Braita a bunch of generations before him. So why is he telling us something that it says in an explicit Braita? So the Gemara answers, Rav Huna matnitin lo shmi alei. He probably didn't ever heard this Braita, and therefore he was saying this halacha as if he was the one saying the halacha. But right now, this isn't interesting. Again, it teaches you about how things worked in those days. If it was an explicit Braita, then you would quote it from a Braita. You wouldn't say, I think the halacha is like this. You would say, the Braita says the halacha is like this. So the fact that he didn't say it makes them wonder, why didn't you say that? It doesn't make any sense that you're teaching us something it says in a Braita. So they answer, oh, he obviously never heard this Braita. And that also teaches you about their times because people didn't always have access to all the Braita. Braita were memorized and people passed them down. So if you didn't hear someone tell it to you, you might not have known of the existence of that Braita. So according to our version of the Gemara, that's how the sugya ends. And this next section starts something new. But Rabbeinu Hananel actually thinks he has a different girsa in our Gemara. And instead of answering matnita lo shmi alei, they're going to answer a different answer. This next section of Rav Chisda is coming to answer that question. So, and then he changes what Rav Huna says. So there's two ways to read this. Either we're talking about a new halacha entirely, and we've kind of closed that, and we answered it by saying it's not a problem, because Rav Huna is teaching us something that says in the Swiss Braita, but that doesn't bother us because he just never heard the Braita. Or this is coming to say, erase what Rav Huna said. This isn't what he said. He actually meant something different. So again, according to our version, that's not what's going on here. And this is just another halacha. And furthermore, Rav Chisda said in his own name. So our version seems to say Rav Chisda passed this down in the name of Rav Huna, which we actually also find the same halacha in a Braita, that it's only mibayit lebayit that you need to do a new borei pragafen. But if you're within the same house, or depending on your version, if you're in corner to corner in the same house, you wouldn't need to make a new bracha. But right, and then he's saying a different halacha, which is another limitation. And then this is basically two limitations versus Rabbeinu Hananel, who thinks this is just erase Rav Huna, and now I'm going to say in my own name, and this is a better answer because Rav Huna was difficult because it already said it in a Braita. So, he said in his own name, first, before I continue reading, because I'm kind of in the middle of a sentence, but I want to just kind of explain this before we move on, which is there's two types of bracha achronas that you make. They fall into, there's three, right? There's borei nefashot, there's ala michya and ala gefen. It's called bracha chamei and shalosh. It's like a mini shortened version of birkat hamazon, and then there's birkat hamazon. Now, there's different rules for them. There's some that you have to say in the place where you ate. So if I ate bread and then I left my house and I remember that I didn't bench, I'm actually supposed to go back and bench at home. That's what's called ti'unim bracha lacharehem bimkomam. The bracha achrona, the one you make when you finish eating, has to be in the place that you ate. So that's true for Birkat Hamazon, and it's also true for Bracha Chamein Shalosh, is ala Michi or ala Perot or ala Gefen, wine, okay, wine, fruits from the land of Israel, right, the 7 Shivat Minim, and the any kind of mizonot. But that's different from Borei Nefashot, which doesn't need, when you say Borei Nefashot, you don't have to do it in the same place where you ate. So now, let's go back to the beginning of what he says. When you say Shinoi Makom Tzarich Levarech, Lo Amaran, that's only Bidvarim She'ein Tu'unim Bracha La'achareihem B'mkomam. When you say that, okay, there's a lot of double negatives. When you say that Shinoi Makom, you need to make a new Borei Preagafen, this is only in a place where you need a bracha achrona in its place. Aval dvarim hatu'unim, my mistake. You don't need a bracha achrona in its place. Okay, we'll explain this whole thing in a minute. Aval dvarim hatu'unim bracha la'achareihem b'mkoman ein tzrichim levarech. Okay, I'll just put it simply instead of using the complicated language. If it's bread or anything that you kind of make into a meal, something of significance, then if you leave and go drink somewhere else, the assumption is you were kovea seuda, you were kind of in this place, which means that your meal is kind of continuing wherever you're eating. So if you move, you haven't really, you're still within the same meal. So you actually, it comes, right, you would think we're more strict, just like we're stricter, that you have to make a bracha achrona there. No, for this issue, we're going to assume that your meal, you're still within your meal, even if you move somewhere else. But if it's something light where you don't really consider it a meal, then you go to a new place. The assumption is you're no longer connected to your original place because you weren't even really eating a meal. So you're not continuing your meal. You weren't even eating a meal. So therefore, that's the distinction that they make. My taima, lekiva kama hadar. You're basically, when you get to the new place, you're basically saying, I'm continuing my meal. Okay, now it's not the most typical thing that you would, in the middle of a meal, move to somewhere else. But theoretically, right? Some people do this. They hop from Purim Suda to Purim Suda, right? We're still with Purim, right? So you could see where you're kind of continuing to just keep, and especially Purim, people like to drink, so they're continuing to drink from place to place. So that's what he says. Rav Sheshet disagrees. He says, no, there's no distinction between what type of thing. If you're going to move house, you need to make a new bracha. Meitive. Now they bring a contradiction from a Tannaitic source, and this is going to take us to the end of the page. And they're going to explain why this contradicts Rav Chisda's opinion, where he makes this distinction between if you're in a real meal, right, or what we call a sudat arai, like a makeshift, like you're just snacking. So he brings this source. It says, B'nei Chavura shayu mesubin lishtot. There was a group of people that were sitting drinking. Okay, we're not talking about mesubin is usually Pesach. No, it wasn't in those days. People were reclined in general. So there were a group of people. It's funny because it's both Pesach concepts. We associate Chabura with Pesach, as we've been learning, and we associate Misubin, but it doesn't seem like it's Pesach. There was a group of people that were drinking. And all of a sudden they heard a chatan and kala were coming. They all leave to go greet the chatan and kala. And they, so they pick up their feet. We're going to talk about these words in a few minutes. They don't have to make sure that before they walk out to greet the chatan and kala, the bride and groom, they don't have to make sure to make a bracha achrona, the bracha after eating, after drinking. When they come back, they don't need to make a new borei preagafen. Now, in which case is this going to be the case? And this is very relevant for Pores Mapal Mekadesh. Okay, again, very relevant to what just went on. And I'll tell you something someone told me about their meal when they did it like this. In which case is this the case? As long as they left an elderly person or a sick person behind, then they don't have to make a bracha. But if nobody was left, now by the way, they say it doesn't necessarily have to mean a zaken or cholet. It's just that if everybody was going to eat the chatan and kala, who's likely going to stay? The people who can't move so easily. They'll say, oh, well, stay here. But really, it could be anyone. They're just kind of giving an example of something that might practically happen. Okay, but it could be anybody stays. And in fact, someone told me when they did Pores Mapal Mekadesh on Purim on the other day, what they do, everybody went, they actually davened in the backyard because they had a backyard minyan. So they all left to go daven in the backyard, but they left some people at the table. So, people who had children, right? That would have been a better example, right? Women who have children, little children who weren't going to daven. So anyone, they stayed at the table and they made sure, but it wasn't just because of that. They made sure that someone stayed at the table so that there would be this continuity, to their meal. If everybody leaves the table and goes out to daven, then there's no more continuity to your meal. And then it's not like it's all really part of the same meal. So that's what they did. So it's the same thing. It comes exactly from here, that idea. So right? So that whole thing is only if they left someone. Right? So if if they left nobody, then they need to make a bracha achrona. And when they come back, they have to make a blessing on the wine again. So now, what's the issue here? We want to contradict Rav Huna. What Rav Chisda? Rav Chisda said, Shinoi makom is only, you need to make a new bracha if you weren't eating a set meal. If you were eating a set meal, then you wouldn't need a blessing, even if you left and went to a different house. Forget about, came back to your original place. So what does he say here? Mida katane. The Gemara stresses the wording here. Akru raglehen. What does it mean, akru raglehen? They uprooted their feet. Now, what does that mean? You only uproot if there's something to uproot from. If you were eating, you were just kind of eating what we call arai, a not permanent meal, then you wouldn't call that akru raglehen. So akru raglehen must mean they must have been eating things that needed a bracha achrona in their place. And yet, what does it say? Tama, it's only because they left somebody. And therefore, that's why they didn't need to make another blessing. But if they didn't leave somebody there, and therefore, this goes against Rav Chisda, who said that that's not important, right? You don't need to have somebody stay behind. If you go to a new house, you wouldn't need to. So, of course, here you wouldn't need to. So, therefore, it's a question on Rav Chisda, and I'll just kind of tell you a little bit of what our answer is going to be. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Man Tana Akirot, Rabbi Yehuda. They're going to say that's Rabbi Yehuda, and there's a machloket Tanaim about this issue, and we'll deal with that tomorrow. And so we'll end our daf here. Have a great day, everybody.